In response? Perfect. The third and final type of learning is known as operant conditioning or instrumental conditioning. And this is the theory championed and developed most extensively by Skinner. What this is learning the relationships between what you do and how successful or unsuccessful they are. Learning what works and what doesn't. It's important this is very different from classical conditioning. And one way to see how this is different is, for classical conditioning, you don't do anything. You could literally be strapped down and be immobile. And these connections are what you appreciate, and you make connections in your mind. Instrumental conditioning is voluntary. You choose to do things. And by dint of your choices, some choices become more learned than others. So the idea itself was developed in a nicest form by Thorndike, who explored how animals learn. Remember, behaviorists were entirely comfortable studying animals and drawing extrapolations to other animals and to humans. So he would put a cat in a puzzle box. And the trick to a puzzle box is there's a simple way to get out, but you have to kind of pull on something, some special lever to make it pop open. And Thorndike noted that cats do not solve this problem through insight. They don't sit in a box for a while and mull it over and then figure out how to do it. Instead, what they do is they bounce all around doing different things and gradually get better and better at it. So what they do is, the first trial they might scratch at the bars, push at the ceiling, dig at the floor, howl, etc., etc. And one of their behaviors is pressing the lever. The lever gets them out of the box. But after more and more trials, they stop scratching at the bars, pushing at the ceiling, and so on. They just press the lever. And if you graph it, they gradually get better and better. They throw out all of these behaviors randomly. Some of them get reinforced, and those are the ones that survive, and others don't get reinforced, and those are the ones that go extinct. And it might occur to some of you that this seems to be an analogy with the Darwinian theory of natural selection, where there's a random assortment of random mutations and sexual selections give rise to a host of organisms, some which survive and are fit, and others which aren't. And in fact, Skinner explicitly made the analogy from the natural selection of species to the natural selection of behavior. So this could be summarized as the law of effect, which is a tendency to perform an action's increased if rewarded, weakened if it's not. And Skinner extended this more generally. So to illustrate Skinnerian theory and operant conditioning, I'll give an example of training a pig. So here's the idea. You need to train a pig, and you need to do so through operant conditioning. So one thing you want to do is, the pig's going to do some things you like and some things you don't like. And so what you want to do, basically drawing upon the law of effect, is reinforce the pig for doing good things. Suppose you want the pig to walk forward. So you reinforce the pig for walking forward, and you punish the pig for walking backward. And if you do that, over the fullness of time, your reinforcement and punishment will give rise to a pig who walks forward. There's one technical distinction that people love to put on intro psych exams, is that the difference between positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. Reinforcement is something that makes the behavior increase. Negative reinforcement is very different from punishment. Negative reinforcement is just a type of reward. The difference is, in positive reinforcement, you do something. In negative reinforcement, you take away something aversive. So imagine the pig has a heavy collar. And to reward the pig for walking forward, you might remove the heavy collar. So these are the basic techniques to train an animal. But it's kind of silly, because suppose you want your pig to dance. You don't just want your pig to walk forward. You want your pig to dance. Well, you can't adopt the policy of, I'm going to wait for this pig to dance, and when it does, I'm going to reinforce it, because it would take you a very long time. Similarly, if you're dealing with immature humans and you want your child to get you a beer, you can't just sit, wait for the kid to give you a beer, like ungrab the bottle, and say, excellent, good, hugs. You got to work your way to it. An act of working your way to it is known as shaping. So here is how to get a pig to dance. You wait for the pig to do something that's halfway close to dancing, like stumbling, and you reward it. Then it does something else that's even closer to dancing, and you reward it. And you keep rewarding it as it gets closer to closer. Here's how to get your child to bring you some beer. You say, Johnny, can you go to the kitchen and get me some beer? And he walks to the kitchen, and then he forgets why he's there. And you run after and say, you're such a good kid, congratulations, hugs. And then you get him to, and then finally you get him to also open up the refrigerator and get the beer, open the beer, and in that way you can train creatures to do complicated things. Skinner had many examples of this. Skinner developed in World War II a pigeon-guided missile. It was never actually used, but it was a great idea. And people, in fact, the history of the military in the United States and other countries includes a lot of attempts to get animals like pigeons or dolphins to do interesting and deadly things through various training. More recreational, Skinner was fond of teaching animals to play ping pong. And again, you don't teach an animal to play ping pong by waiting for it to play ping pong and then rewarding it. Rather, you reward approximations to it. Now, basically, there are primary reinforcers. There are some things pigs naturally like. Food, for instance. There are some things pigs actually automatically don't like being hit or shocked. But in the real world, when dealing with humans, but even when dealing with animals, we don't actually always use primary reinforcers or negative reinforcers. What we often use are things like, for my dog, saying good dog. Now, saying good dog is not something the dog has been built, pre-wired to find pleasurable. But what happens is you can do a two-step process. You could make good dog positive through classical conditioning. You give the dog a treat and say good dog. Now, the phrase good dog will carry the rewarding quality, and you could use that rewarding quality in order to train it. And through this way, behaviorists have developed token economies where they get non-human animals to do interesting things for seemingly arbitrary rewards like poker chips. And in this way, you can increase the utility and ease of training. Finally, in the examples we're giving, whenever the pig does something you like, you reinforce it. But that's not how real life works. Real life, for both humans and animals, involve cases where the reinforcement doesn't happen all the time, but actually happens according to different schedules. And so there's a distinction between fixed schedules versus ratios, variable schedules, and ratio versus interval. And this is something you could print out to look at. I don't need to go over it in detail. The difference between ratio is a reward every certain number of times somebody does something. So if every 10th time your dog brought you the newspaper, you gave it hugs and treats, that's ratio. An interval is over a period of time. So if your dog gives you, I don't know, dances for an hour straight, that would be an interval thing. And fixed versus variable speaks to whether you give a reward on a fixed schedule, like every 5th time, or variable, sometimes on the 3rd time, sometimes on the 7th time, and so on. And there are examples here, and I don't need to go over them. It's easy enough to think of examples in real life. So for example, a slot machine is variable ratio. it goes off after it's been hit a certain number of times. It doesn't matter how long it takes you to do it, it's a number of times you pull it down. But it's variable because it doesn't always go off in the 1000th time. You don't know, it's unpredictable. The slot machine is a good example of a phenomena known as the partial reinforcement effect. And this is kind of neat. It makes sense when you hear it, but it's a sort of finding that's been validated over and over again with animals and non-humans. Here's the idea. Suppose you want to train somebody to do something. And you want the training such that they'll keep on doing it, even if you're not training them anymore, which is typically what you want. If you want that, the trick is, don't reinforce it all the time. Behaviors last longer if they're reinforced intermittently, and this is known as the partial reinforcement effect. Thinking of this psychologically, it's as if whenever you put something in a slot machine, it gave you money. Then all of a sudden it stopped. You keep on doing it a few times, but then you say, fine, it doesn't work. But what if it gave you money 1 out of every 100 times? Now you keep on trying. And because the reinforcement is intermittent, you don't expect it as much. And so your behavior will persist across often a huge amount of time. I mean, here's a good example. What's the very worst thing to do when your kid cries to go into bed with you? And you don't want him to go into bed with you? Well, the worst thing to do is for any form of discipline with a kid is to say, no, absolutely not, no, 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 okay. And then later on, the kid's going to say, I want to do it again. And you say no, and the kid keeps asking. Because you could put it, the way I'll put it is in a psychological way, not the way the behaviorists would put it. The kid knows, okay, he's not going to get it right away, he's going to keep on asking. And so typically, what you're doing inadvertently in those situations is you're exploiting the partial reinforcement effect. If I want my kid to do something, I should say yes 1 out of every 10 times. Unfortunately, that's the evolution of nagging. Because you nag, you nag, you nag, person says, fine, okay, and that reinforces it. If Skinner kept the focus on rats and pigeons and dogs, he would not have the impact that he did. But he argued that you could extend all of these notions to humans and to human behavior. So for example, he argued that the prison system needs to be reformed. Because instead of focusing on notions of justice and retribution, what we should do is focus instead on questions of reinforcing good behaviors and punishing bad ones. He argued for the notions of operant conditioning to be extended to everyday life, and argued that people's lives would become fuller and more satisfying if they were controlled in a properly behaviorist way. Any questions about behaviorism? What are your questions about behaviorism? Yes?
So the thing with the poker chips, wouldn't there be extinction after a while?
Good question. The discussion was over using things like poker chips for reinforcement. And the point is exactly right. Since the connection with the poker chips is established through classical conditioning, sooner or later, by that logic, the poker chips would lose their power to serve as reinforcers. You'd have to sort of start it up again, retrain again. If you have a dog and you say good dog to reward the dog, by your logic, which is right, at some point you might as well give the dog a treat along with the good dog. Otherwise, good dog is not going to cut it anymore.